All right, it's week 6 in the New Testament portion of the Bible read along. So, how's it going for you? Are you feeling comfortable in your reading? Or do you feel like you're making progress and establishing good habits? We hope so. This week, we're continuing in the Gospel of Matthew, where we've begun making progress as we move towards the story of the cross and the empty tomb. Now, what are we going to see this week? Well, you're going to hear Jesus denouncing the religious leaders for their hypocrisy. Jesus uses hypocrisy, as a way of describing people who pretend to be on the outside what they are not on the inside. And specifically, he says the religious leaders of his time, the scribes, the Pharisees, the members of the ruling Sanhedrin, these people are hypocrites because they claim to be God's people, but they don't submit to God's Son. They have lots of other faults that Jesus will point out, but they all really unite under this one thing. They reject the one whom God has sent. Remember the parable Jesus tells about the tenants who own the vineyard, and when the son is sent to collect the rent, they say, let's kill him and then the vineyard will be ours. Well, that's the reason Jesus criticizes these religious leaders as hypocrites. Jesus will then warn the disciples of hardships that they're going to experience. Jerusalem is going to fall to the Romans in a generation, and they need to flee from that. And Jesus actually presents that as an expression of God's judgment against the temple leaders who had rejected him. But that hardship is just part of many of the hardships that they will experience. And in the middle of that, God is still going to accomplish his purpose through them. Now, beyond all of those hardships, Jesus promises he's going to return to establish his rule over the earth. And remember, the disciples aren't even expecting him to leave, but he's already saying, I'm going to return and establish my rule over the earth. And so what do they need to do? In the meantime, they need to be ready. And what does that look like? Well, Jesus says that looks like servants who do what their master tells them to do, even when the master is absent and they expect him to return, though, at any time. They're like people who are prepared to wait a long time for the great event, the arrival of the bridegroom. They need to be like people who are serving faithfully in Jesus' name for the least of these, because Jesus is going to become the least on the cross. He's identifying with us in our weakness and our lowliness and our need. And then Jesus is going to gather with his disciples for the Passover celebration. The disciples are still completely clueless about what's going on, and Matthew's going to portray that for us vividly. But Jesus knows what's happening every step of the way, and he shows that. And that's important because that way we know Jesus' life isn't taken from him. He isn't surprised. He isn't overcome. He isn't overwhelmed. No, Jesus gives his life willingly and knowingly. So what's the big picture here? Well, throughout the Gospel of Matthew, throughout the New Testament, Jesus is Lord and Jesus is in control. Jesus knows that his followers are failing, but he continues to gather them around him. They are there by his mercy and grace, not by their merit or attainment. Jesus challenges all other authorities. People who don't like Jesus don't like him because he is telling them that he is Lord and they are not. And Jesus makes that very clear every step of the way. And so in all of this, we see that in Jesus, God is making the world right. God is taking his world back. God is establishing his rule over the world. God's kingdom is breaking into the world. And that's good news. The good news is the world has a new king. It is Jesus Christ, who came, who lived, who served, who preached, who died, who rose, who now is seated at God's right hand, and who will return for his people. May we serve him faithfully as he rules in heaven and as we await him on earth.